Hello and welcome to the fourth and final webinar of the Cisema webinar series for 2021 on NMPA registration of medical devices and IVDs in China. I'm Hamish.
And I'm Jackie. And today we will present on a number of different topics about China regulatory affairs for medical devices and IVDs.
First, a little bit of housekeeping. We will speak for around 50 minutes. Allowing for 10 minutes Q&A at the end. So as your questions come to you, please don't hesitate to type them into the chat box and we will address them at the end. If you'd like, or if you've missed this webinar or missed a section that you'd like to recap, a replay link will be sent in the week following the presentation. If you'd like a copy of the slides, please don't hesitate to email us to ask.
First, we would like to introduce Cisema to you. Cisema stands for China Service Management, and we are a regulatory affairs consultant and CRO for China. We were founded in 2002 in Munich, Germany, and Beijing, China by a former Siemens engineer. We now have 12 offices worldwide with nearly 100 employees, most of those on the ground in China. Please sign up to our monthly newsletter on China certification, which you can do on our website.
A little bit more about us. I'm Hamish and I'm COO at Cisema. I'm a lawyer by training, admitted in New South Wales, Australia, and Hong Kong, which has been my home for the last 6 years. I formerly worked with the UK Magic Circle firm Linklaters.
And I'm Jackie, and I've been with Cisema since 2019. I've studied my bachelor's in Canada and previously worked in Bureau Veritas that specialized in testing, inspection, and certification. I also worked in Yahoo, where I had the opportunity to work with their global team in digital tech. Now I'm the Cisema lead to support the Hong Kong and China regulatory affairs for customers from Taiwan and Hong Kong. In this final webinar of the year, we will examine the following topics: Order 739 and recently implemented supporting regulations, IVD latest updates, recent regulatory updates about some popular product areas like medical software, China QMS, and post-market surveillance matters.
Thank you as always for listening. This webinar series has had an impressive, engaged, and growing audience, and we appreciate your support. Okay, let's begin.
You may remember this slide if you have participated in our previous webinars of the series, but it is important to appreciate the new regulatory framework for medical device and IVD regulation in China. The new top-level law governing medical devices and IVDs came into effect on June 1st, 2021. It is called Order 739. NMPA has been busy since then implementing supporting regulations, which we will talk about shortly. A quick reminder of the hierarchy of laws is set out on the left-hand side of the slide. Laws issued by State Council, then regulations issued by NMPA, followed by standards and technical review guidelines.
And now also set out on the slide is a short history of the top-level regulations for medical device supervision and administration. Prior to the year 2000, there was in fact no safety law for medical devices, and they could be imported without restriction. It's only following Order 206 in the year 2000 that an application form had to be submitted, but could be done so with relative ease. It was in 2014 that the regulatory framework was vastly made more substantial and increased, with further tweaks made in 2017 and again in this year into Order 739 as we know it today.
While there are still 8 chapters in the order with the same titles, 27 articles have been added and 70 articles modified. Additions were primarily in the bolded chapters in the slide relating to registration and filing, distribution and usage, supervision and legal responsibilities.
We spoke in part 2 of our webinar series about some of these important changes, and we've just set them out here again on the slide as a reminder, but if you'd like to go into the detail, please refer back to our earlier webinar series. It's about increasing flexibility and maturity in the approach to pre-market approvals with an emphasis on innovation. It's about formalization of the MAH system for domestic enterprises, hopefully with importing enterprises in the years to come. It's about increased emphasis on post-market surveillance and whole of product lifecycle regulation, which is the topic we're going to address today, and increased penalties for transgressions. Now we're just going to develop this a little bit further to talk about some of the other important changes that have occurred underneath the framework of Order 739. In particular, there's a more versatile clinical evidence that can be used to support clinical evaluation, including use of clinical trial data on own previous generation devices not yet registered in China. This is a possibility, although it's certainly not a blanket availability. This speaks to a difficulty for many global companies and their China strategy, because your China entry, of course, usually comes after the US or EU, which means it could be 3 to 5 years later. By this time, a second generation device is in development or even undergoing home country approvals or has obtained approval. Whilst there was in some earlier versions of the new clinical evaluation regulations for Order 739, a suggestion that previous generation devices registered outside of China could be used as a predicate instead of only NMPA registered products. That was missing from the final issued regulation in September, which is shown on the following slide. But helpfully, NMPA has said that clinical trial data from previous generation devices can, in some circumstances, be used to support a new second generation registration. Some other points that are worthwhile mentioning about the evolving Order 739 regulatory framework is that the clinical exemption conditions have been expanded and clarified. There's now a more dynamic risk classification catalog to determine clinical exempt status. If there's a clear working principle, matured design, approved predicates in use for many years without any serious adverse events, and establish a routine use, then it will likely be exempt from the need to write a full clinical evaluation report. On the other hand, clinical trial management is being improved. Not all medical devices without predicates need to conduct clinical trials necessarily. And on the other side, hospitals are encouraged to develop and strengthen their clinical trial programs to support the clinical trial industry. Also, clinical trials are in general approved by default unless there's a specific objection by NMPA. Conditional approval with support of post-market data is another interesting new development, as well as lab-developed tests for IVDs that we're going to talk about shortly. Self-testing is another hot topic, and to demonstrate the speed with which regulator is evolving the framework, a first draft of this supporting regulation was issued in June of this year, then a second draft in July, and the final version in October, together in an interpretation note from NMPA. Order 739 itself had set out that self-testing, instead of the sometimes painful local testing process, could be available to manufacturers. However, as the detail of the final regulation about self-testing has revealed, the reality is that all but a very few domestic companies will be able to satisfy the requirements because of stringent requirements relating to on-site standards inspection required by NMPA and the China inspection body.
And here is a more detailed list about the many supporting regulations. These expand, explain, and clarify the overarching Order 739. Many came into effect from October 1st, 2021. Importantly, administrative measures for medical device and a similar measure for IVD are now in effect, replacing the existing versions that were over 5 years old. IVD increasingly has its own regulation framework in recognition that this important category of life science products has its own special requirements. Previously, it was considered by the regulator mostly under the same regulations as medical device. Here, we provide more detail about the latest IVD regulatory updates. The China NMPA has shown to become more and more mature with the application review and approval of IVDs. The total number of NMPA applications, which includes the initial registration renewals, and changes in licensing items. So these applications received by the NMPA has increased by 7% in 2020 as compared to 2019. While the number of approvals of IVDs that were granted by the NMPA increased by 30.1% in 2020 as compared to 2019. We've also noticed that the China NMPA is actually paying more attention to IVDs as more and more specific regulations are coming out. As seen at the bottom of the table, the administrative measures of IVD registration and filing was announced on August 26th. However, unlike the previous 2014 version, the IVD classification rules weren't combined together with the administrative measures. Instead, the IVD classification rules were published on October 29th as an individual document for the first time. Since clinical trial data is one of the important supporting information to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of medical devices, including IVDs, the recent guidelines for IVDs have stricter requirements in terms of comprehensiveness, readability, and statistical analytics when compared to general medical devices. On this slide, we've set out the typical IVD reagent products and the responding risk class, which may be of interest to IVD manufacturers. Specimen processing products are class 1, while testing for proteins, hormones, etc. are class 2. Human gene testing and tumor markers are risk class 3. Blood screening and radionuclide markers are regulated as drugs in China. Lab-developed tests now have recognition in China, but the specific requirements are still being worked through, and the rules are not the same as for the US. But for IVD that do not have predicates approved in China, qualified medical institutions can develop for their own clinical needs and use them within the institution under the guidance of practicing physicians.
Shifting gears a little bit, as you may recall, medical device software includes software that is the medical device itself, SAMD, or software contained in the medical device, SIMD. There are 3 broad aspects of software-specific considerations. First, we should consider the classification of the software. NMPA will use that as an important determination of its scrutiny. Secondly, NMPA will encourage manufacturers to consider the expected use scenarios, and core functions of software products so as to carry out corresponding risk management activities. And finally, we need to consider the security level of software products in the life cycle. In recent years, NMPA's software audit is more and more standardized and rigorous. In particular, the test verification and validation in the software description file, as well as the review of software versioning and software updates, etc. In the description of software network security, the review of network capability, security update, maintenance, and emergency response plan is particularly strict. There have been quite a number of recent guidance documents about SAMD and SIMD, as this slide shows. We don't have time to go into the detail, but I think the list does help give a sense of the seriousness with which the NMPA is addressing the difficulties of regulating such products and the speed with which it's evolving its thinking and scrutiny.
And here is a high-level picture of the key developments for SAMD. To demonstrate the importance with which the Chinese regulator is committed to AI, machine learning, and deep learning product regulation, in March 2019, it established the AI Medical Device Standardization Unit, responsible for terminology and processes for development and quality assurance. NMPA has also established an online cooperation platform for which we have provided the link, although the platform is only in Chinese language at this stage. Then in June 2019, the NMPA released its first guidance on deep learning products, which helped to clarify NMPA review points for such products. Most recently, a guideline for AI products was issued which clarifies how AI software is classified into 4 application directions according to the intended use, which includes decision support software, image or data processing software, analysis and data mining products, and medical assistance products. Only categories 1 and 2 will be regulated as medical devices, whereas 3 and 4 will not. Furthermore, medical software using AI technology is by default class 3 because application is still in its infancy and clinical practical risks have not yet been fully evaluated. However, the guideline also foreshadows that as a regulator becomes more familiar with the technology, the risk class could be adjusted.
So another product area of interest to our customers is robotic products, especially surgical navigation devices. And here's a snapshot of key regulations for preparing for your NMPA registration application. The oral implant surgical navigation guideline is quite a specific one, but just thought I'd point that out as a very recent addition and change in September, adding clarity for the growing number of dental medical devices that are imported to China. Robotics devices in China are classified as those which track, position, or plan or treatment or trajectory during surgery. Key guidelines and standards to follow include that on the laser product safety and other active device guidelines.
The rehabilitation equipment market in China is a fast-growing one, and so we also share here a snapshot of key guidelines and risk class examples for this important product category. There is separate Chapter 19 in the NMPA classification catalog for medical rehabilitation devices. Most rehabilitation equipment is Class 1 or 2, although some items fall into Class 3. China risk classes are often more conservative than the US or EU, so don't be surprised if your product is up-classified. Non-electrical products like wheelchairs are Class 1, but most rehabilitation devices fall into risk Class 2, like mobility aids. Orthopedic implants will be risk Class 3. Key standards to be aware of rehab equipment include those listed on the slide. Just a reminder that the Chinese national standards are called Guobiao, which is GB for short. If no GB standard exists, industry standards like the YY standard will be used as test standards. Guiding principles for registration of rehabilitation equipment is whether it's for the upper or lower extremities, then followed by whether it's active or passive motion rehabilitation device. As an example, if the rehabilitation device is a balance training system, its registration in China needs to meet the standard YY/T 1410 of 2016. In addition to this industry standard, it also needs to comply with the relevant GB or national standards. It will all be very product specific, so if you would like to know what is relevant for your product, please get in touch with us.
Okay, now we're going to shift gears a little bit to move the discussion to some specific topics of China QMS and post-market surveillance. With
NMPA placing greater emphasis on the regulation of the complete product life cycle, post-market surveillance is receiving more attention. This is reflected by more field inspectors at local NMPA levels, as well as the doubling of the post-market monitoring department at the national NMPA. On January 1st of 2019, the medical device adverse events monitoring and evaluation was implemented, along with a new electronic reporting system. The decree following the vaccine scandal with the firing of the chief of NMPA and other key personnel shows the Chinese government is going to invest heavily in this area and implement more comprehensive and strict regulations. The NMPA has been expanding its toolkit to strengthen post-approval supervision across the whole product life cycle. New and increasingly used tools include the UDI system, the adverse event monitoring and evaluation system, the product recall system, routine inspections, unannounced inspections, overseas inspections, special enforcement campaigns, device quality sampling and testing, and several other approaches. When these supervision and enforcement measures become routine, they will monitor product quality and efficacy on a constant and dynamic basis, adequately safeguard patients, and minimize the need for pre-market clinical trials whenever possible. The NMPA was focusing on pre-market registration surveillance in the past, but a lot of recent effort could be seen put on post-market surveillance. And the full life cycle surveillance is the NMPA's target right now. This can be seen in the Order 739 as well as recent implementing regulation.
Yes, and we support customers implement China QMS or NMPA legal agent, localizing production and registrations according to the recent accommodating regulatory changes and frameworks. The production quality management specification, which we're now going to move into more detail to talk about, is part of Chapter 3 in the overarching law. And it's a specific requirement for NMPA legal agents. We're going to see how that fits together shortly. Just before we do so, a reminder about the NMPA legal agent role and your key options for selecting an NMPA legal agent. There are three broad options. A distributor, which may seem like a more simple, straightforward solution, but we caution you about this selection because China is such a large market and you generally need more than one distributor, and having your distributor as your legal agent has complications for this because it requires the cooperation of the legal agent to make the first import. So distributors may not want to cooperate. Also, they have a de facto exclusivity there and receive lots of confidential information. Having your own subsidiary seems to be the best option, and it probably is longer term, but it requires some substantial investment, including having regulatory affairs, PMS capabilities. The third option is to have an independent third party. Cisema acts in this role for many customers, where you have someone who is an expert in reviewing the many frequent changes to the regulations and also ensuring that the manufacturer receives all information and it doesn't have conflicts relating to distribution. So having said that, yeah, let's go now into a bit more into the QMS piece, and then we're going to come back to NMPA legal agent specifically.
Just a reminder about regulation and standard hierarchy for China. These are divided into compulsory and recommended standards. Compulsory standards refer to the standards that include technical contents and requirements implemented in the form of state law. For violations of compulsory standards, the state will pursue legal liabilities of the parties in accordance with the law. Recommended standards refer to the standards that are instructive but not enforceable, which are encouraged by the state to be adopted voluntarily. It can be used in combination with the actual situation, and these have a /T after them.
Yes, although I just add that in our experience, the recommended standards generally are strongly recommended standards. So you should comply with them unless there is another overriding requirement. Set out here on the slide now is the chapter headings of the medical device production quality management specification. And I'm going to move to talk briefly about a few of the important chapters. Chapter 2 about the institutions and personnel sets out the requirements for personnel engaged in the work affecting product quality. These are the relevant positions and personnel. Training procedure documents and annual training plans for Chinese law and regulation updates and compliance are important to keep in mind for your QMS system. And the key point is to ensure that personnel who affect the quality of the medical device have the relevant knowledge, awareness, and ability to ensure product quality. Chapter 5, document management. The document management article talks about what are the documents you need to ensure are up to date and managed according to the law. document review, file identification, procedure files for external document management, follow-up and control. These are the key points. And more broadly, manufacturers must establish a regular tracking system for documents such as regulations, standards, customers or suppliers to ensure they're updated and, if necessary, republished in a timely manner to prevent use of expired external documents. Regarding that external document management, we've set out here on the right-hand side of the slide some of the key considerations around the full life cycle surveillance for regulations, the standards that need to be reviewed for and to ensure your PTR, which is the appendix to your certificate, are kept up to date, and the dynamic management of Chinese regulations and standards is required. This is made increasingly true with recent releases that make it quite clear that manufacturers must update their certificates with any important new changes to standards, and they can't necessarily wait until their next product change or renewal. Also, we'll point to the internal documents. There's importantly the PTR, which I mentioned, which is part of the certificate, test reports like electrical safety reports, EMC reports, biocompatibility test reports, and also change approvals, etc. And the last point I just allude to is the Chapter 10 sales and after sales service. Qualification of medical device sales that is written in your business license, for example, needs to be managed. And importantly, the management model of the enterprise for distributors. You need to check the distributor list and randomly check files of a certain distributor to check completeness of files and legality of their qualifications. Also check and combine product performance and focus on the ability of the distributor. Check whether the sales agreement includes traceability and record-keeping requirements, and extract product sales records to require distributors to provide distribution records in accordance with the agreed requirements within the specified period of time to achieve product traceability.
So the new responsibilities of NMPA legal agent. On December 25th of 2018, the NMPA released the supervision and management tasks of NMPA legal agent of imported medical device. But in August of this year, the requirements were clarified in the administrative measures for medical device, which came into force at the start of September. There are 5 key requirements: establishing quality management systems suitable for products and maintaining effective operation, formulating post-market research and risk control plans and ensure their effective implementation, performing adverse event monitoring and re-evaluation in conformity with legal provisions, establishing and implementing product traceability and recall system, and other obligations stipulated by the Drug Regulatory Department under the State Council.
Yeah, and we also need to think about the administrative measures requirements against the Order 739 requirements as well, which is the top level, of course. And both of these have specific and more general requirements for NMPA legal agent responsibilities.
So in order to ensure product quality in the area of life science, the NMPA expects foreign manufacturers to be proactively assisted by local legal representatives. The NMPA published a guideline on responsibilities on August 3rd of 2018, the guideline for imported medical device local legal agent. These include the manufacturer's support for the approval of its product and a compliant Chinese user manual. There are 7 key sections of Order Number 1, the responsibilities and obligations, report and evaluation, priority monitoring, risk control, re-evaluation, monitoring and supervision, legal responsibilities. Other responsibilities of the legal representative include monitoring and reporting of adverse events in China, as well as their feedback to regulators and supervisors' oversight of quality control. For this purpose, on August 13th of 2018, the NMPA published Order Number 1 on the reporting of adverse events for medical devices. According to this new regulation, the NMPA legal agent must play an important role in activities that go beyond the original tasks of supporting during product registration alone. The regulation decrees that adverse events overseas have to be reported to the NMPA, and the report has to be prepared by the local lawyer in China. This provision translates responsibility for control, proactive monitoring, and quality issues equally to the manufacturer and the NMPA legal agent. The system is designed to improve the risk management of medical devices after commercialization. It aims to monitor, assess, and correct adverse events in this product group. And the NMPA legal agent plays as much more important role in this than before. As a local legal representative, he is responsible for ensuring that the post-marketing requirements are fulfilled without the manufacturer having to set up his own office in China. The major changes include provincial NMPA offices that will take major responsibility for surveillance instead of the National Test Center that was in the past. It means more staff and quicker action for a notified inspection, that so-called the fly inspections. Overseas adverse events are required to be reported, and the report must be conducted by a local legal agent. Adverse event records shall be kept 2 years after the expiration date, or 5 years if no expiration date is provided. Implantable device registration holders shall keep their records permanently. Foreign manufacturers need to be aware of the data retaining difference between China and other countries. Yearly risk analysis becomes mandatory. Penalties such as stopping production, suspension of importation, and fines are specified for first-time violations.
Yeah, and here's a little bit more detail about those requirements as well. The monitoring of adverse events is a very important role for the NMPA legal agent within China, and which really means supporting manufacturers to ensure that adverse events are reported in good time, and also risk evaluation reports are regularly prepared. When an adverse event occurs, then the information needs to be reported to NMPA, and the NMPA cooperate with the NMPA as it requires. The safety of medical device should also be reevaluated when such events occur. So the manufacturer also has a role here and must continuously examine the medical devices already approved by NMPA in order to assess risks and monitor the adverse events. The relevant measures took effect in the start of 2019, as Jackie said, and the manufacturer has a number of obligations, including to establish the QMS, which we've talked about a little bit earlier, although the manufacturer also needs to ensure they have a department with relevant professional personnel who can monitor the adverse event, proactively collect them, and so on. The PRER the periodic evaluation report is also an annual requirement, which we're going to talk about shortly. And as you can see, there's quite substantial additional responsibilities that manufacturers may be fairly familiar with from their home country, but are relatively new innovations in China. Just going into a little bit more detail, again, about the new adverse event reporting requirements. Where requested by a government official, it needs to be submitted to the national centre, and also if self-initiated, then it's submitted to the local NPA, who will forward the report to the relevant national centre for ADR monitoring.
So medical device adverse events refer to various harmful events that have occurred in the normal use of approved medical devices that have caused or may cause human injury. And serious injury includes life-threatening injury, permanent damage to the function or structure of the body and need of medical intervention to prevent permanent damage. So what adverse events needs to be reported? Only serious adverse events, SAE, have to be reported, but minor adverse events do not. China is a centralized system with 34 provinces, with 5 key entities in the 8 adverse events monitoring system: national NMPA, provincial NMPA, city-level NMPA, the hospital, and market authorization holder. The market authorization holder must analyze and evaluate adverse events and conduct medical device safety assessment proactively. Market authorization holder, the distributor, and device user facilities, including the hospitals or clinics, they will need to report to the National Medical Device Adverse Events Monitoring System with the help of the NMPA legal agent. The post-market clinical data of the CER, Clinical Evaluation Report, there are very important requirements here.
And here's a little bit more detail about handling of adverse events and the legal agent responsibilities. Reports should be made within 7 days in the case of individual local adverse death cases, or within 20 days if there's there's an event that may cause serious injury or death. In a case of group adverse events, reports must be made within 12 hours by telephone or fax, and within 24 hours for each individual. There's a 7-day requirement for group adverse events, as set out on the slide, for evaluation results to be provided to NMPA, or rather to the relevant provincial MPA, who will then forward the information to the NMPA itself. I would just set out some key headline points about research, assessment, reporting, proactive and timely, as to the agent responsibilities for adverse event reporting.
In March 2021, the National Center for Adverse Drug Reaction Monitoring of the NMPA released its 2020 annual report, providing an overview of China's progress for medical device adverse event monitoring and reporting. So the key highlights are, in 2020, there were 536,055 adverse events reported in China, and in 2019, there were 396,345 adverse events reported in China. So there's an increase of 35.25% of the total number of adverse event reports. For severe injury reporting cases, there's an increase of 23%. So in 2020, there were 218 reports, which is 0.04% of the total adverse events that reported death cases. And in 2020, there are 32,874 reports of the total of the reports, which is 6.13% of the total adverse events that reported severe injury cases. And there's an increase of 23% compared to 2019. In 2020, 455,782 adverse events were reported by users, which are the medical institutions and consumers. 11,191 adverse events were reported by NMPA legal agents, while 68,902 adverse events were reported by manufacturers. About 40% of the total adverse events were reported related to infusion care and protective equipment. And this report should be read together with the NMPA's periodic risk assessment. And it further illustrates the NMPA's emphasis on post-market surveillance. If you are familiar with the US FDA regulations, you might notice that the definition of product recalls in China are very much similar to the FDA's. Medical device manufacturers conduct defective product recalls by warning, inspection, repair, relabeling, modification, and improvement of IFU, software update, replacement, recovery, destruction, etc. Foreign manufacturers can designate their NMPA legal agent in China to conduct a recall. So there are 3 recall levels in total. Use of the medical device may or has caused serious health hazards. Use of the medical device may or has caused a temporary or reversible health hazard. Use of the medical device is less likely to cause harm, but still needs to be recalled. And defective medical devices includes products with unreasonable risk that may endanger human health or life under normal use, products that do not meet the technical requirements or mandatory standards, products that do not meet the relevant production and quality management regulations, which may lead to unreasonable risks.
And also on this slide, we just set out a milestone plan really of responding to a product recall. Starts with a notice and reporting form, and of course finishes with a summary report.
On July 2nd of 2020, the NMPA released the updated guidance document for preparing the periodic risk evaluation report for medical devices, addressing the timescale and data collection scope for preparing and submitting the initial report. The period risk evaluation report of Class 1 medical devices should be prepared annually for the first 5 years and should only be submitted online via the NMPA adverse event reporting system when required. The preparation of annual reports can be omitted after 5 years. The periodic risk evaluation report of Class 2 and Class 3 medical devices should be submitted online via the NMPA adverse event report system. The data collection start date should be consistent with the date on the registration certificate. For medical devices whose specifications were registered in different certificates, for example, different specifications of disposable sterile syringes, or medical devices that must be used together with other devices under a different registration certificate, for example, hip systems, which include femoral stems, etc. The risk assessments can be incorporated into one report, but should be submitted before the earliest deadline. The registrant should include any related information of the medical devices upon the submission or archiving of the report. If the registrants intend to incorporate the risk assessments into one report for medical devices of the same kind, they should conduct a subgroup analysis based on the registration certificate number. This new reporting requirement is consistent with the NMPA's push for continuous post-market surveillance. Since 2019, post-market compliance, adverse event, and annual reporting regulations are increasingly strict. It is important for companies with registered devices to be vigilant with their ongoing requirements and not take a set and forget approach. The role of NMPA legal agent is therefore increasingly important.
And a little bit more about the PRER. As you can see here are the main contents of the report, which need to be submitted annually. The NMPA requires you to provide, of course, adverse event details if they have occurred and summaries, product risk analysis, and any supporting documents like literature related to risks. The language of the report can actually be English in some areas, although Chinese is the general requirement for most. Data gathering, it depends on the registration type, but as Jackie specified earlier, for products 2 and 3, risk class 2 and 3, it should be re-provided every year. Another topic related to post-market surveillance is sampling inspections, and NMPA issued draft guidelines which have been implemented relating to inspection of medtech products. NMPA provincial officers are instructed to inspect medical device manufacturers and distributors in their provinces, and we are seeing this occur increasingly regularly. The checks concern production process, inventory, warehousing, internet-based processes, etc. For foreign companies, they will be particularly affected by the storage and distribution requirements and should review their actions. You can see potential triggers set up here on the slide. They include if it's a high-risk device or there's a large population of users, if there's some special complaints or public concerns, then that's likely to trigger a sampling inspection. And similarly, if there's adverse events reported or if there's potential for the product quality to be easily affected.
Another aspect of managing your NMPA certificate is considering whether to localize production in China. For companies that do want to localize, there is a recent NMPA announcement that facilitates transfer of certificates from foreign to local. We mentioned it in part 2 of our webinar series, but the final guidance has now been released, so it is worthwhile to refer to that again briefly. The finalized version was published in September 2020. Expedited approval pathway for the medical device made in China. This pathway first becomes available when the main raw materials and production processes don't change. You should also make sure the quality management system is consistent with the previous one.
Yeah, and we often get asked, what does it mean to localize production? Effectively, it is at least, or usually, the final assembly. That can potentially be sufficient for localization of production in China. But it, of course, is always product specific. And we're happy to look into that more for you if it's of interest. There are 2 general options, by the way, about the localization process, which we can support. Either to set up just a local sales entity, market authorization holder, or a more substantial wholly foreign-owned enterprise manufacturing facility. And there's positives and benefits to both of those, including protection of IP versus speed and convenience and cost. One other aspect about certificate management that we'd like to mention is that there's a fairly important change relating to certificate management at time of renewal. Since the announcement just in October of this year, it's no longer possible to undertake a product change and a renewal at the same time. So companies, again, need to be increasingly aware and on top of the standards changes for their products, because this may have a flow-on effect to your certificate effectiveness over time and during the renewal process. As you will recall, renewals must be submitted at least 6 months before expiry, which is 5 years for class 2 and 3 products. But if there's some substantial standard change requiring a product change, then this can take 18 months or more if you take into account redoing the local testing. So as I set out here on the slide, previously it was possible to make your product change at the same time as a renewal, which was a fairly straightforward and simple process. But now companies must make the change first. So this simple graphic outlines the changes. Okay, so that comes to the end of our webinar, and now we're just going to do a brief recap about the series so far, because it has we have gone through a lot of detail about the registration process. So it makes sense just to recap briefly, and then we'll move on to the Q&A if there are any questions. What did we learn in part 1? We talked about the NMPA itself and the regulatory framework of medical device and IVD regulation in China. We talked about the types of NMPA approvals, and we talked about some of the trends in registrations. We also went into detail about the clinical pathways and filing and registration processes for the different risk classes. What types of documents do you need? What standards and type tests really mean? Again, as Jackie said, if you'd like to review that again, we will be happy to provide the webinar link to you. Otherwise, you can find it on our website.
And what did we learn in part 2? So we've talked about the hot topics and latest regulatory changes. We've talked about Order 739, the classification changes, medical device master filing, and all of them are a colorful mix of different themes about the regulatory environment in China that is fast changing. And in part 3, we've talked about the alternative entry pathways to China, which also includes the Order 739 and its effects on China registration, the fast track pathways with NMPA itself, the Hainan zone and Hong Kong listing through the Greater Bay Area sales.
And today, just to recap, we talked again about Order 739. And yes, I know that's 3 times we mentioned it, but that's because it is the new regulatory framework in China, and it itself is continually changing. As Jackie mentioned, that is the regulatory environment. It is fast changing. And so, that's why we're very happy to provide these regular webinars to keep you up to date. We've also talked today about some specific product regulatory updates and standard requirements. And then we've gone into a bit more detail about post-market surveillance as well as QMS. Thank you, as always, for listening. And just a final brief thought before we move to questions.
As medical device manufacturers, you may be asking, what are the implications of the information we covered today, or why is it important to me?
And the implications are that no matter your medical device or IVD product, it all starts with your regulatory strategy and your clinical pathway, which is your foundation step to entering the rapidly growing healthcare market in China. As we've pointed out, and maybe you got a sense, of course, the regulatory environment is very fast changing and you can feel like you're shooting at a moving target. So that's why we're very happy to support you as best we can. Thank you. Now we'll move to questions. Thank you very much for your attendance and look forward to connecting with you soon. Have a nice day.
Thank you.